Hi friends, we're going to talk about the painting tools today. Those include the pencil, brush, paint bucket, and gradient tools. We'll also talk briefly about the eraser and eyedropper as well. First, though, we want to talk about color so that we have a color to choose to use with these different tools. When you first open Photoshop, chances are your colors will be set to the default black in the foreground and white in the background. The foreground color is the square on top at the bottom of your toolbar. If you double click it, you can either choose another color here in the color picker using this slider and then the selection circle. You'll also notice if you move your cursor over to the canvas or anywhere outside of the color picker, it gives you an eyedropper, and you can eyedrop any color from the canvas or the workspace around it. So start by picking a color for your foreground. We won't worry about the background color yet. That will come up with some of the different tools, but let's focus on picking a foreground color to use our first tool, the pencil. The pencil is probably going to be hidden underneath your brush tool. If you can't find it and you're maybe in another tool, you can click B for brush, and that'll show you where the brush tool is. Pencil is right below it. So let's get your pencil tool and come over to the canvas. I have a couple different layers already set up because I have my text and background color already, but you don't need to worry about that yet. You can just have one layer for drawing on. And you'll notice when I come over to the canvas and click and hold, I can start drawing with my pencil. About the only things you can change with the pencil are the size of your pencil. So if you click this little dot up at the top here, you can see that you can change the size to get a larger or smaller pencil. The hardness doesn't change though. Even if you change this, you won't notice a difference. So we'll talk about that with the brush instead. So mostly with the pencil, you can just change the color and the size. Some of these other things are things that you can change with any of the painting tools. So just quickly, opacity is how solid or transparent your tool is. So you can always change the opacity of the tool itself up there at the top. And there are some other things that you can experiment with as well. So to move on to the eraser tool quickly so we can get rid of some of this stuff, let's click on the eraser tool, or you can use the shortcut E. And if I start, drawing over my canvas with the eraser, it'll start erasing things. I want to change the size though so it goes faster. Again, you can change the size up here, or you can use your brackets. So the left bracket will make your brush or your painting tool smaller. This works for any of them. The right bracket will increase your brush size. So I'm going to make my eraser really big so that I can erase that quickly. We've talked about the eraser briefly. We've talked about the pencil. Let's talk about our brush. So let's hold down on the pencil tool and get the brush instead. Like I said, you can change the color and the size for your brush just like the pencil, but now you can also change the hardness and the style. Here's some of the different things we can do with different sizes. Now notice what happens when I change the hardness. That's the hardness all the way up. But if I turn the hardness all the way down, look at how fuzzy that edge gets. That's a soft edged brush, and this is really good for when you're doing blending things, or if you want to do something just a little softer than that really hard graphic edge that allows you to kind of blend colors together. So again, that's the hardness of your brush. Hardness all the way up makes a hard defined edge, and hardness all the way down makes that soft edge. Again, I'm going to use my eraser to make some space here. Some other things you can change with your brush tool, if you come up to the top where we change the size and hardness, you can also choose some different brush styles down here. So general brushes, these are just kind of like your basics, but if you start to experiment with like the dry media brushes, you'll see there are some that simulate things like charcoal, things like, pastels. You can experiment with any of those. There's new brushes that you can also download online, so you can find anything from like smoke or hair You can find, feathers or leaves. There's just so much cool stuff online if you want to start to download some different options. So let me find some other colors too so that these will show up. There's patterns and things too. I don't like that color with these, but oh well. So yeah, have some fun experimenting with the different brush options that you have. Those are all up there in the brush options panel. Okay. We have talked about so far the pencil, the brush. We've talked about the eraser. Let's touch on the paint bucket now. And again, I'm going to use my eraser to get rid of all this. So the paint bucket, if you hold down G, it's going to take you to where the paint bucket is hidden. It's hidden under the gradient tool. That's why the shortcut is G. Let's get the paint bucket first. So this tool, when you have a foreground color selected and you click, it's going to paint that color everywhere until it hits a border or another color on that layer. Since I didn't erase these things on this layer, it painted through those. Now when I erase, you can see I'm erasing from that color that I just painted in. So now that I've gotten everything off that layer, and I'll prove it to you, here's the empty layer with all my others turned off, and I click G for gradient, but I know I have my paint bucket enabled. Now it's going to paint that solid color. What if and this is a really, really bright, still a really bright color, so I'm going to get something a little softer. What if, though, with my paintbrush, I paint a border? So, this will be interesting to experiment with. So I have my old brush style picked out. I'm going to go with something just, one of the basics, like this. So already you can see those different brush qualities. So now I'm going to get my paint bucket again, and we'll choose white. When I paint inside of that area, you can see that the paint bucket only goes until it hits an edge and fills in that entire space that's enclosed by that color. When I paint inside this, though, because it's broken up, that color bleeds through and paints the entire canvas. So those are some of the differences with the paint bucket. I can paint inside of borders, but you can see that it's leaving that little bit of the black edge there that was kind of used as the border inside that paint bucket. Again, I'm going to go through and erase the stuff from this layer so that we can have a little more space for the next stuff we'll talk about. So again, the paint bucket is just going to paint one solid color in an entire area until it hits a border. Talking about the gradient tool now, this is where the foreground and background colors are really going to come into play. So let's pick a foreground color and a different background color. And you can select a background color just by double clicking the square on the bottom, the background color square. So now I have my foreground and background color selected. I'm going to get my gradient tool. The default should respond to your foreground and background color. So when you click and drag, it's going to make whatever gradient style you have selected. The default should be a linear gradient. So that means when you click and drag, it's going to make a gradient between your foreground and your background colors in a line. If I click and drag this way, again, it's going to apply those colors in a line according to how I dragged. So that's a linear gradient. There are some other options as well. So there's a radial gradient where wherever you click and drag from is the center or the middle point of the circle, and where you're dragging becomes the radius. There are things like angle gradients. So I'm choosing those up here at the top, where one part of what you drag is going to be an angle, and then the other part it's going to be a gradient between the two colors. I'm not really sure when you would want to use this. There are things like reflected gradient. So where you click and drag from, it's going to mirror that on the other side of your canvas. And then there's also a diamond gradient. So where you click and drag, it's going to make kind of like a starburst shape according to where you're dragging from. So that's some of the basics of how you use the gradient tool. There are some presets that you can use. So some of those include like other combinations of colors that are already picked for you that have certain effects if you want to use those. There are also presets for using the foreground color fading to transparency. So like, and it's doing that because that was the background on that layer. But if I make a new blank layer and hide everything else, I'm going to click up here in the corner and drag down to this corner. So you can see it's using my foreground color right here as one part of the gradient. And then it's fading to transparent or see-through where I let go. So that's another preset up there for you. Again, you can experiment with all these different like color options that are already made. There also is going to be just a default option with black and white. So to get back to black and white in my colors, like if I've chosen some random colors at this point, and I'm like, I just want to do a good old fashioned black and white gradient. At any point, you can click D, and that will reset your colors to the default of black in the foreground and white in the background. If you want to switch between those two quickly, you can hit X. And now when I drag in the same spot, it should be, well, guess it's not. It should drag from your foreground to your background. But it's, oh, you know what? It's probably because I have that preset chosen up here, so it doesn't respond. Okay, so if I go back to the default, which is my foreground and background, right now my foreground is black. When I let go, it's going to drag from black to white. If I switch my foreground and background, now when I drag in the same spot and let go, it's going to drag from, again, my foreground, which is now white, to black. The last thing, just quickly, if you ever need to get back to a color you used and you can't, pick it on the color picker, like that's a really hard thing to do, you can always use the eyedropper tool. So if you hit I for, like ice cream, it's going to take you to the eyedropper tool, and that will allow you to select any color on your canvas and start painting with that color again. So if I get my brush and a layer, it's going to let me start painting with that color that I selected with the eyedropper. So hopefully that helps give you something to get started with all of these tools and start experimenting with color, the painting tools, and all the settings that go along with them, and see what kind of stuff you can make.